To Be or Not to Be was released in 1942 and was directed by Ernst Lubitsch and stars Carole Lombard and Jack Benny, and is set during the Nazi occupation of Poland, where an acting troupe becomes embroiled in a Polish soldier's efforts to track down a German spy. This has been a movie that's been on my watch list for a few years now, ever since one of my best friends recommended the movie to me, and I just have never been in the mood or haven't had the chance to watch it until recently when my girlfriend and I did. And I can't believe it's taken me this long to finally see it because I'm so glad I did. To set the scene, my girlfriend and I have been going through the 1001 movies you must see before you die. And we originally started out just picking random movies, and we realized that we were just taking too long trying to pick something, or we were picking movies we already knew about. Well, we had the bright idea to actually put the entire list on a wheel and let fate decide our movie. And since then, we've had so much fun going back and forth through different decades, watching movies we probably never would have if it wasn't for using a wheel like this. And that's how we ended up watching this movie. And by the time we finished it, we both had nothing but praise for this film. And I would go so far as to say this is one of the greatest films ever made and should be held up in high regard as a masterpiece of comedy. But before we get into my thoughts, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. Ernst Lubitsch was a German-born director who had already been making a name for himself as one of the most elegant and sophisticated directors working in Hollywood, with some of his best-known works being Trouble in Paradise, Ninotchka, Heaven Can Wait, and this film, which came out the year prior. Lubitsch had only considered Jack Benny for the lead role of the film when the movie was written, even writing the character with Benny in mind for the part, and Benny was eventually happy to take on the role after being thrilled that a director like Lubitsch had been seeking him for the part. This proved to be good fortune for Benny as he was having trouble finding work after the success of his film Charlie's Aunt a year prior to this film's release. As for the role of Maria Tura in the film, the studio and Lubitsch had been seeking Miriam Hopkins, whose career was in a decline, and the role was designed as a comeback film for the actress. But Hopkins and Benny did not get along, so she would eventually leave the production, which led Carole Lombard to replace her. Lombard had never worked with Lubitsch before, but longed for the opportunity, and soon she was cast in the picture alongside Jack Benny. The film would go on to be her final performance, though, as she would die the year of its release in a plane crash. The film was shot at United Artists, which had been founded by pioneers of the silent era D.W. Griffith, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, which was supposed to be a pioneering company where there was a lot more control over the pictures by the actors and directors as compared with other studios. When the film was released, it was made on a budget of $1.2 million and only made $1.5 million in U.S. rentals. There are many factors going into this, one of which was the initial reception of the film and public apprehension of the satirical depiction of the Nazis. It was criticized for taking such a serious threat and using it for the basis of comedy. Many believed it to be in bad taste. Criticism was pointed to Benny and Lubitsch, while praise was given in particular to Lombard. Benny's father would actually storm out of the theater after seeing his son in a Nazi uniform for the film before he was convinced to return after understanding how the film was meant to be seen as a satire. Benny's father would go on to see the film 46 times in the theater. There were positive reviews, with some calling it Lubitsch's best film and solid entertainment, and some critics actually loving the comedy. Since then, though, the modern critics now regard this film as one of the director's finest achievements, and it is an example of a film coming out at just the wrong time. The movie would go on to be nominated in 2 different categories at the Academy Awards, one for Best Music and the other for scoring in a dramatic or comedy picture, and is now considered one of the greatest films of all time by film historians and enthusiasts. The movie would even go on to have a 1983 remake at 20th Century Fox, starring Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, which was not as well received as the original film. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go into my thoughts on the film. To Be or Not to Be is the definition and a prime example of what a masterpiece is. It's perfect at every level, from directing, acting, writing, editing, score, cinematography, production design, costume design. Every part of this movie was so expertly crafted that it's hard to not just say it's all great and leave it at that. I was so surprised when watching this movie. I thought I would like it based simply off of my best friend's recommendation, but I was not prepared for how much I would actually fall in love with the film. And after watching this, I'm so excited and even a little nervous to look at Lubitsch's other films in his career, because I just don't know how anything is going to compare to this now. I'll start off by talking about the emotions I was going through while watching the film to give you a prime example as to how this film won me over from minute one. We start on the streets of Warsaw with some wonderful wordplay from the narrator to find Adolf Hitler, of all people, walking the streets, and we go into why he's there, and we see this hilarious scene of a group of Nazis all together, and they meet with Hitler himself, and there's so many great gags, including one where they constantly say Heil Hitler to an exaggerated degree, and that reminded me a lot of similar jokes Taika Waititi made in his own comedy about Nazis in Jojo Rabbit. And then we see Hitler walk in and he follows up the Heil Hitlers with Heil myself. It's then revealed these aren't Nazis, but are instead our heroes of the film disguised as Nazis. So the film makes itself clear from the start that it is, at the heart of it, a comedy satirizing the Nazis. But then, after some introductory scenes to set up the characters and the main thrust of the story, the film actually gets serious and becomes more dramatic after Poland becomes occupied by Germany. I became nervous at first while watching because I was wondering where all the laughter had gone. But to my surprise, Lubitsch uses this dramatic portion of the film to set up the seriousness of the situation. The film is a comedy, but it is based on real horrific events that are happening, and what follows after that is this marriage between the two that never lets up. The film is as funny as it is tense, and what we are left with is comedy gold. Every joke lands, and you will think they're running a joke into the ground before they turn it on its head and make the joke fresh and new again with new context. It's comedy at its absolute best and most sophisticated. I can understand why people might have thought the film was in bad taste when it was originally released, but when you watch the movie, it's clear to me that that was never the intention. It brings so much lightheartedness and laughs in a time where it was one dark chapter in the history of the world, and I think strips the Nazis of their power, and I find that brilliant. I also find the performances and characters so endearing. We of course have Jack Benny and Carol Lombard as the Polish acting couple Joseph and Maria Tura, who are just so great in the film. Jack Benny is an absolute natural at comedy and is so hilarious, and watching him bicker with Carol Lombard is something I could watch for days. There's also a great gag in the film from which the movie gets its name, where Joseph Tura is playing Hamlet, and every time during the To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, there's a man who gets up out of the audience and goes backstage to meet with Maria Tura, and they end up having a small little thing together. But the expression on Jack Benny's face at that moment is perfect every time. Carole Lombard brings so much class and romanticism to the role of Maria Tura and has some wit of her own, especially during scenes where she is attempting to seduce the spy Professor Selitsky. But they're not the only ones. There's also Colonel Earnhardt as a bumbling Gestapo commander, and his lackey, Captain Schultz, are so hilarious together that their relationship might be my favorite in the entire film. And Earnhardt may honestly be my favorite character. He's just so fun and expressive and likable, and that's another thing, is how likable everyone is in the film. The Nazis are obviously the bad guys and are never portrayed as anything other than the enemy, but the film doesn't try to make them unlikable. The very opposite, in fact. Characters like Earnhardt and Schultz are so endearing, and when a particular scene happens near the end of the film, you do strangely feel bad because you grew to actually like those characters. The movie just knows how to balance the comedy with the more dramatic moments of the story that manages to work far more than you would think. There's moments of darkness in the film, such as the final scene with Earnhardt, or the incredibly tense situations our characters get into as they try to assassinate Professor Selitsky, and especially when Joseph Tura begins disguising himself as different Nazi characters, such as the Professor and the Colonel. You're literally on the edge of your seat wondering, when is he going to get caught? You're constantly wondering what's going to happen next. The tension just builds and builds, and each tense situation somehow leads to a more intense, even worse situation than the one before, and it's perfectly executed. It even helps that the tension and the comedy go hand in hand, and one would honestly not work without the other. Now, I think it's time I talk about my favorite scene in the entire movie that encapsulates everything I love about this movie in this one scene. Jack Benny's character at this point has disguised himself as Professor Selitsky after the real Selitsky is killed. His mission is complete, and all he needs to do is get a plane to get himself and his wife out of Poland. However, he's unaware that the Nazis are onto him because they have found the body of the real Professor Selitsky and believe Benny's character to be a spy. They put him in the same room as the body, where Benny, realizing he has an extra fake beard on hand, shaves the dead Selitsky's real beard off and places a fake one on there. He sends the Nazis to show them that the real Selitsky is actually an imposter when they pull the fake beard from him. Everyone is in the clear. Benny's character, Joseph Tura, is safe. Until, unknown to him, his own theater troupe comes to rescue him, pretending to be Hitler's safety guard, and reveals Joseph to be an imposter, Selitsky, and telling the Nazis that they will be taking him away. It's absolutely hilarious, and that scene to me is a prime example of how this film works. It builds up with tension as well as laughs, and as the tension builds, so does the comedy, and it builds and builds, and it just never lets up until we get to the film's satisfying conclusion and everything is alleviated. The movie also makes good use of reoccurring jokes, such as the to be or not to be moments, or even a hilarious moment when Joseph is disguised as Colonel Earnhardt and talks about being called Concentration Camp Earnhardt. And he keeps saying that over and over because he's run out of things to say in a conversation with the professor. And then we see that joke have its final punchline several scenes later when the tables have turned and Joseph is not impersonating the professor and tells Earnhardt that they call him Concentration Camp Earnhardt. And he ends up loving the joke. It's so brilliant. To Be or Not to Be is so perfect in execution. It's a comedy that's just as funny as any of the best comedies coming out in the past 20 years. And is super timely and universal. All the performances are perfect, the characters are likable, and the comedy is on point. There's simply nothing quite like this movie, and I'm glad it is now getting the recognition it now deserves as an all-time great. As for negatives I have with the film, there are none. This is pretty much as perfect a film as you can get. The pacing of the scenes and the jokes, it all manages to land where it could easily falter in other lesser comedies. But here, there is no faltering. Everything is perfect, and this is definitely going to be a film I plan to revisit for now on, because it truly is, in my eyes at least, one of the greatest comedies and greatest films ever made. And with all that said, I'm going to give To Be or Not to Be a 9 out of 10. This film is fantastic. As soon as I finished it, I knew I had just watched an absolute classic. I'm actually interested in seeing the remake eventually. I don't know if I would end up actually reviewing it, but I'm going to keep it on my radar in case the time comes when I want to see it and see how it holds up against the original. If you haven't seen To Be or Not to Be, and you want to watch some older films from Hollywood's golden era, look no farther than this film. It manages to say quite a lot in a film that, at its surface, just looks like a fun comedy, but provides likable characters on all sides and tension that keeps things urgent until the very end. But anyway, with all that said, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.